Hello, students of English literature, and welcome to this lesson. Today, we are going to talk about Romanticism and Transcendentalism. A lot of isms. Anyway, starting with the years and where these isms occur, so to say. Now then, in 1785 up until 1830 in Great Britain, we have the literary period called Romanticism, and from around about 1820 to 1865, we have a literary trend called Transcendentalism in USA. Now then, Transcendentalism is based on Romanticism, and a lot of the ideas come back in Transcendentalism. So we'll talk about both, and we'll sort of point out the similarities and differences for you, okay? Now then, first of all, we need to sort of address world events. What happens in the world at this time? Well, for one, the Industrial Revolution has started. It starts very early in Great Britain, and we're basically industrialized and urbanized quite early here. And a bit later, we have the Industrial Revolution in America, primarily in the north of the USA, because the South is basically a bit more dependent on farming and stuff. They have cotton farms and things in the south of the US, so they don't really feel the idea of industrialization, okay? Now then, urbanization means that you basically move from the countryside to the cities, which basically leads to that the countryside becomes deserted. But Industrial Revolution and urbanization means that workforce is quite cheap, because it's not all that easy to get. It is easy to get jobs in industries, but it's not all that easy for everyone to get a job of any kind, and we don't have any worker unions or anything, so basically that means that if you get a job, then you're basically at the boss's mercy. So you have to settle for a lousy pay and lousy work hours and stuff like that. Yeah. And in Britain, we also have the fact that we've outlawed slave trade, which means that we need another source of cheap labor, and that is also people that come in from the countryside. In the USA, the conflict between the urban north and the more rural south eventually leads to a civil war that lasts for a while. And, well, it lasts basically through this entire literary period, so it is a big factor, a big influence in literature at this time. We also have a lot of spiritual movements in the US at this time. Among others, a group of people called the Theosophists, I think, is the English word for it, that believe in other things than Christianity, basically. And they believe in spirits and ghosts and other things. Yeah? So, good thing to remember here. So how this comes back in literature. Firstly, we have to make one thing very clear. The previous era, which is the Enlightenment, had an emphasis on logic and reason. Everything had to be logical. Everything had to be able to be documented in a scientific way-ish, and they were a lot more political in the Enlightenment era. So what Romantics do is that they they don't like this. They think that we should not have focus on logic and reason and more have focus on feelings and impressions and stuff. So that becomes the basics of the basis of of Romanticism. What they also reacted against was urbanization, and how we can see that in Romantic literature is that the Romantics used to glorify nature a lot, and they expressed a sort of loathing towards society and social constructs. One thing that Romantics also reacted against was child labor, because child labor was quite common in the cities because of the industries and things, and it was quite normal for the entire family to work. So dad had to work, mom had to work, and children had to work in like coal mines and stuff because the holes in which these carts were pushed around in were really small, and only children would fit. That's an example, but still. And Romantics thought that children should be able to be children, so they sort of protested against child labor at this time. Now then, Romantics thought that men were born good instead of men being born bad, as it was in the Enlightenment era. And again, knowledge is gained from impressions and feelings and how we interpret them rather than logic and reason. Romantics believed in individualism, that every person was unique, and that every person deserved personal freedom, like Mel Gibson, right there. Yeah, you can look for these things in literature as well when we work with it. Basically, we can say that the Romantics were a lot like these guys, like the hippies, and it is not uncommon to call the Romantics the hippies of the 1800s. Yeah. Now then, we also have a new genre literature. It's called Gothic, and it's very dark and melodramatic, and it focuses more on mystery and exoticism and scary stuff, right? Kind of like the picture there. And there are some differences in British Gothic literature and American Gothic literature, but we'll come to that in just a second. Now then, similarities and differences. In Great Britain, this is called Romanticism, as I said, and in the US of A, this is called Transcendentalism. And both of these literary movements have an emphasis on nature and what's natural and stuff. But the British were a bit more political. They took a stand against child labor and complained about the industry ruining the countryside and stuff, whereas the Americans didn't really care about that. They cared more about wanting to create American literature, what was typically American. So, for example, the idea of the American hero is born around about this time. Okay? We also have more spiritual elements in American literature than we have in British literature. In American literature, ideas like people are all connected in spirit and stuff like that is more common than in British literature. And both of these literary movements have the Gothic themes, but the British are a bit more, well, they're less spiritual and more physical, whereas Americans love spiritual stuff, okay? So there are a bit of a difference there. There's a bit of a difference. I hope that's not too confusing for you. If it is, just ask me stuff and we'll Now then, pop. Oh, I see it says popular genres. I mean popular forms, though. Poetry is quite common in Romantic literature, and particularly free-form poetry, but we have some poetry that are bound by nursery rhymes and stuff like that as well. But seeing as freedom is sort of an important thing in both Romantic and Transcendental literature, um, Romantics and Transcendentalists felt like form isn't really all that important. Short stories are also a popular form, and horror stories are really popular at this time. Famous, famous horror story writers Edgar Allan Poe, Mary Shelley, and others. Yeah, we can talk about some writers here. Mr. William Blake, who's a Brit, has written a lot of things, among others, songs of innocence and songs of experience. Blake was not only a poet, he was also an artist, which is seen by this lovely painting in the bottom. You might recognize it from the film Red Dragon. If you haven't seen Red Dragon, go see it. Yeah. We also have Mr. William Wordsworth and Samuel Coleridge, both Brits as well. And yeah, Wordsworth is famous for poems listed there in PowerPoint, and Coleridge is most famous for the poem Kubla Khan. We also have the Mrs. Wollstonecraft and Shelley, both named Mary. Now, Mary Wollstonecraft was one of the first feminist writers of our time. She wrote the Vindication of the Rights of Women, and that has served as an inspiration for feminist movements in the late 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, and even today. And Miss Mary Shelley is, of course, famous for Frankenstein. In the US, we have writers like Mr. Walt Whitman, who is famous for Leaves of Grass and Songs of Myself. We also have Ralph Waldo Emerson, who wrote a paper that's called Nature. Do we have any more? Of course we do. We have, of course, Mr. Edgar Allan Poe, as I've mentioned. And yeah, just to sum this up then, Romantics and Transcendentalists reacted against logic and reason, industrialization, and urbanism, but they celebrate nature, individualism, freedom, impressions, and feelings. Main differences between British literature at the time and American is that British literature is more political, more physical, if you will, whereas American literature is more spiritual. Now then, I hope you've learned loads, and if you still have questions, please write them down and ask them when we have class next time. Until then, bye bye.